Have everybody give us a round of applause for Calvin Johnson and Stephen Salam.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael.
Anger is not a trait I was born with. It began in prison, and it grows each day. After 10 years, my anger has started to assert itself. For most of my life, I took pride in being easygoing, slow to react, and naturally calm. But I have changed. I have become unsociable and quick to argue, but who wouldn't? I wake up each morning to prison bars in the company of men I would not choose as friends. My time and my life are totally controlled and hopeless. As soon as I open my eyes, I am mad. The gnawing in my stomach now accompanies the dawn of each new day. I am so angry that complete madness cannot be far away. Bitterness is a drug, an addictive substance. It haunts me each minute, whispering its catechism of complaints. As much as I try, I cannot calm the increasing volume of these voices. I cannot reason my way out because my anger is so reasonably constructed. I am innocent. I've been railroaded and no one will help me. I have followed all the rules, been patient in my appeals for help, and nothing. My case for hatred is airtight, and the facts arrange themselves in my mind without effort. It is consuming me, and I am losing myself. Up until now, I have contained the rage beneath a thin shell of control, but now the surface has cracked. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Calvin C. Johnson, Jr. I spent 16 years in the Georgia penitentiary for a crime I didn't commit. What I just read to you was an excerpt from my book, Exit to Freedom. I'm going to tell you how it all started. It was a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful spring day. I can remember it like it was yesterday. I was walking down the street. I had got off work, went to the gym, worked out, pumped up. I mean, I was like, hey, you know. Yeah. So don't laugh now. And I was on my way home. But something strange about that day. I remember that day I felt a strange feeling. Something just didn't feel quite right. I got off the bus and was walking down the street, and there's an area on the way home, there's a wooded area. And I felt some trepidation as I approached that area, like something ominous. And I hesitated. And right at that time, my mother rode up the street in the car. And I was like a little kid. I ran and jumped in the car. She didn't know how I felt. And I was just happy to see her. We went home, went inside the house, and no sooner than I walked inside the house, there was a knock at the door, like doom, doom, doom. I tell people that was the weight of the state. Doom, doom, doom. We opened up the door. They don't give you a chance to pack anything. They put me in handcuffs. Put me in handcuffs so tight that on some areas of my wrist you could still see small scars. That was over 20 years ago. They arrested me and they charged me with the charge of rape. At that particular time of my arrest, I had no idea what I was being arrested for. They didn't even tell me. They took me and they threw me in a jail cell, just like you see on television. And this is the truth. It was actually a cold, dark, damp cell by myself. I was wondering what was going on, but I knew I hadn't done anything. I knew I was innocent of whatever they may be charging me with. Waited till the next morning. It wasn't until the next morning when I finally found out they were charging me with 2 rapes, one in Clayton County, Georgia, one in Fulton County, Georgia. These counties are side by side. So one rape happened within maybe less than a mile of the other rape, and they were similar. So they said the same person committed both rapes. They took me and they put me in a live lineup. Most of y'all know what a live lineup is. They take a couple of guys, 6, 7 guys that have been in prison, and they put them behind a 2-way mirror, and you stand up in a line. As you stand up in a line, they bring people in that are accusing you of committing certain crimes against them. And they go and they look, and they pick a person, or they pick that person, and they pick that person, and they try to pick somebody out. Well, the victim that I was actually charged with picked out a person, signed the affidavit, but it wasn't me. It wasn't Calvin C. Johnson Jr. who they picked out. The last person that came into the room was a person from another county. I don't know what happened during that course of that time, but by the time the last person, because they had several people, but by the time the last person, I had nobody pick me out. When the last person came into the room, apparently for whatever reason, the last person said that I was the person that committed the crime. I didn't even go to trial for that crime right away. They weren't even going to take me to trial for that crime. So I came out and they said, hey, my lawyer told me, said, they didn't pick you out. Somebody else picked you out. And I'm like, wow, am I going home now? Because just like all of us, I believed in America. I believed in America's justice system. It could do no wrong. As a kid, if a police officer arrested somebody, he did something wrong. If a judge said you were guilty, you were guilty. If I watched TV and they said this person got caught doing this, I believed it. And we're all guilty of that. We all do that. You hear about somebody in your neighborhood that's been arrested for raping people in your neighborhood, and you see the news and they say person caught, first thing you do, you say, wow, they got that person. I hope they lock them up forever. And you're happy, you feel relieved. But that's convicting that person without a fair trial. And that's what happens a lot. It's not that we're innocent until proven guilty. A lot of times we're guilty until we prove ourselves innocent. Well, the next step was they took me to a preliminary hearing. A preliminary hearing is like a mini trial. It's where they bring out the evidence and they see if they have enough evidence to bound it over to a grand jury to indict you, which will take you to the main trial and charge you with the charges. Well, we went to the preliminary hearing. Very, very interesting preliminary hearing. At the time of my arrest, I had a full beard. Nothing was mentioned in the reports from the police or from the victim about anybody fitting that description. I had a full beard. We went to the preliminary hearing. We testified and said, hey, he had a full beard. Okay. So they asked the victim, who said, well, how was Mr. Johnson identified in the first place? And she said, from a photograph. They said, well, what kind of photograph? Were they black and white? Were they color? And she said, well, I think they were color. But the photographs were actually black and white. I shook my head. I couldn't believe it. I kept thinking, any minute, I'm going to go home now. The judge is going to dismiss this. He's going to see that a mistake has been made. But it didn't happen. They continued on with other testimony, took me back from the preliminary hearing. I'm waiting to hear what happens because I'm thinking, wow, the evidence is overwhelming in my favor. They got to let me go, but they don't let me go. They come one day and they pick me up in the jail cell and they take me out and they take blood samples, take me to a local hospital. They take blood samples. They strip me down. They put me in a room and they take hair samples. This is humiliating because I'm naked, I'm chained up, I got to walk like this because they got me chained from head to toe. And even after I get undressed, they put the chains back on me. They start plucking hair samples from my body. They take all of this and decide that they're going to go test it. They come back and they compare this with the semen that were found at the scene of the crime where the rape occurred. And they come back and they say, okay, the blood samples are O positive. Now, I want to ask everybody a question. O positive, over 40% of the population is O positive. It's the most common blood type. How many people in here are O positive? Please raise your hand. Guilty, 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 guilty. That's what they told me. I'm O positive. So they said, we must have the right guy. He's guilty, because I'm O positive. But the hair samples came back and they belonged to somebody of African-American ancestry. But they did not match Calvin C. Johnson Jr. They didn't match me. And I'm like, I'm going home now. I'm all excited again because I just know, hey, any minute, they're going to say, hey, the hair samples don't match it. Got to let me go. But did they let me go? No, they didn't let me go. They held me longer, and they kept me. I'm like, what's going on? The hair sample showed it wasn't me. Put me back in the jail cell. Next time I come out the jail cell is to make the jury selection. At this time, we're in Clayton County, Georgia. This is back in 1983. Clayton County, Georgia was a predominantly all-white county. The victim of the crime was a white female. I'm a black man. We have 2 people out of all the people to select to be on the jury that are black. Of course, they get struck. So I ended up with an all-white jury. Now, I don't like to point fingers. I don't like to say that race played a hand in it. But if it was an all-Hispanic jury and the victim was Hispanic, what do you think? An all-Asian jury and the victim is Asian, what do you think? So it was an all-white jury and the victim was white. We go to trial. And a lot of evidence is brought out during the course of the trial. They go back to the photographs. And they say, well, my lawyer points out that said that you identified him from some color photographs, contradictory testimony. But the photographs were black and white. This is showed to the jury. They asked me, do you have an alibi? Well, at the time the crime took place, I was staying with my parents. I was living at home. I didn't have a car. I went to work every morning about 4:30 in the morning. My dad gave me a ride to work. Had a dog in the house that barks. My mother, she has a habit of sleeping out on the couch, watching TV late at night. She was out that night sleeping on the couch. As usual, my dad got up, took me to work. My mother testified. My dad testified, saying that I was at home at the exact time when the crime took place. And my mother is old-fashioned. I got one of them old-fashioned moms. If I did something wrong, she'd whip my butt before the court to do. You know? But she knew that her son was innocent, and she knew that I didn't do anything wrong. And she couldn't believe what they were trying to do to her son. My supervisor for my job came. He testified and said at the time the crime took place, this man had a full beard. He showed I had an ID picture, employee ID picture. Shows me with a full beard. No description given. Later on, the victim tried to say that it may have been stubble. Well, I think there's a big difference between stubble and a full-grown beard. I've always had, they didn't even mention a mustache. I've always had hair ever since I was a teenager. I had a mustache when I was 16 years old. I looked like a little old man running around high school. But I had a thick mustache. But they didn't even mention this fact. So all this is brought out. The testimony of the blood sample. Of course, the prosecutor used that, said, well, he's O positive, he had to do it. But we brought out the testimony of the hair samples. And all this was brought out, and I said, well, what are they going to do? And I looked into the eyes of the jury, and they had that disgusted look. They looked at me like I was some type of animal. And there was always this emotional point where they asked the victim, said, can you point out the person in the courtroom that committed the crime against you? There's not that many black people in the courtroom. She turns around and she says, he did it. And the jury like, oh. Well, the jury went out and deliberated, came back approximately 45 minutes later, very short deliberation. They served cake that evening. I think they were celebrating in the jail, and found me guilty. I came back about a week later for my sentencing, and they sentenced me to life. Life plus 15 more in the Georgia penitentiary. I look back at my mom. I can see that right then it seemed like her whole life changed. I believed that I could deal with what I had to deal with, but I didn't know how it was going to affect her. And they took me away to prison. After I got to prison, I found out that the other case in Fulton County where the lady supposedly, the last one that came in, apparently identified and said this person committed the crime, they weren't even going to take me to trial for the other case. You know, this lady I'm in jail for identified somebody else. Even got the photographic evidence wrong. But yet, the other trial is not even going to happen. So somebody who's really bright said, why don't you ask them to take you to trial in the other county? And maybe, just maybe, you can use that as a way to help you gain your freedom. I said, well, I'll do anything. And then folks come up to me and say, man, you crazy. You already got one license, they're going to give you another one. I'm like, so? Life is life. What can you do to me? You know? I was willing to do whatever it takes to prove my innocence. And we asked them and we forced them to take us to trial in Fulton County. Fulton County is in the city of Atlanta. Clayton County is outside the city of Atlanta. The city of Atlanta had a very diverse jury makeup. It was a copycat trial. Everything was the exact same witnesses, same testimony. I even put my character at stake. I took the stand. And once you take the stand and put your character at stake, they can bring up the fact that you've already been convicted of the same crime. Do you know how hard it is to get a not guilty verdict? And how doubly hard or triply hard it is to get a not guilty verdict if you put yourself on stand and they say, this guy's already convicted of the same thing? But the evidence was so overwhelming. It was 7 blacks and 5 whites on the jury. They came back and they found me not guilty. Everybody said, wow, what are they going to do now? But Fulton County and Clayton County are 2 separate counties. I was hoping that this would help me immediately, but no, I still had to deal with Clayton County. Went through the appeal process, went to prison. I remember going down into prison. Prison is not fun. They sent me to the hardest working camp in the state of Georgia. I was young, 25 years old at the time, strong, strapping young man. And the camp was a small camp of about 200 men. And everybody there either had a life sentence or at least 20 years on up. It was a hard camp, and they worked you. It was a work camp. And they used to take us out in the morning time, and before they take us out, they would feed us like breakfast, and the warden and a couple of guards would walk around with shotguns on their shoulder over a little area up above us and look down like they were making sure that we ate good. And they fed you a lot, but the food wasn't that good. We ate to survive. That's what I call it. We ate to survive. We could throw the food out, the meat, sometimes we didn't know what it was. We call it mystery meat. We could throw it out to the cats, and the cats would walk away from it. It was that bad. But you learned to eat what you had to eat. And they would take us out. I'll never forget working out there. I'm a city guy. And they got us out there in this swamp water, up to my knees, and sometimes a little bit higher, with moccasins and around bushes where rattlesnakes are. Now, I was used to moccasins and rattlesnakes. I wouldn't say I was used to them, but I knew what they were. I saw them on TV. I saw them on National Geographic. But this thing ran across in front of me one day. It looked like a rat with an army helmet. I said, whoa, what's that? They looked at me and laughed and said, man, that's nothing but an armadillo. I'd never seen an armadillo before in my life. Scared me to death. I almost got shot. But you know, I laugh about it now. But those were serious, hard times during prison time. I never forget one night in prison, we used to sleep with our boots on. People say, why? Why are you sleeping with your boots on? I said, because you never know. In the middle of the night, you may hear screaming. Even now, sudden loud noises sometimes cause me to tense up. Not as bad as it used to, but when I first got out, if I heard a sudden loud noise, I would tense. Because if you heard a sudden loud noise in the middle of the night, it was usually something going on. I remember one night, we had what they call store man. This guy borrowed something from a store guy. They had the prison rules where you pay back double or triple. This guy didn't pay it back. He tried to sneak some money in through somebody else. That night, he was sleeping underneath me in the bed. The bed went to shaking. Boom, 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 boom. He got stabbed. He was being stabbed in the middle of the night. These are the type of things I had to deal with. It was a nightmare. It was horrific. And then I had to deal with the common things, like the parole board. Coming up before the parole board, they had a program where they call SOP. I said, what's SOP? Sexual Offender Program. We want you to take this rehabilitation course. And if you get rehabilitated, then we can see about giving you parole. I said, okay. So, but I didn't want to take that program. I told the counselor, I said, I'm not guilty. I'm innocent. Why did I have to take a program and sit in there with other people that had committed sex offenses? I said, that's inhumane. But yet, they tried to force me to take the program. I had family members that used to say, or friends, that loved me, that wanted to see me get out. They say, play the game, take the program, say you did it, just so you can get out. So what happens is, I go before the parole board, and I don't take the program, and they tell me that I'm not showing any remorse. They're not set them responsibility for the crime. And I get set off. The person who takes the program, he might get out. He might make parole. So an innocent man remains in prison, but a guilty man walks free. These are the things that I had to deal with mentally for years and years and years. I had a counselor tell me, he said, Mr. Johnson, if you don't take that program, you'll probably die in prison. That's a hard blow. I thought about it and said, what would my life be when I walk out of prison? And I walk out and I go out to the mailbox and the neighbor runs out and grabs the little kid and runs in the house because the sex offender next door is outside. That's no life. Who would give me a job? What could I do? I told myself I'd rather die in prison than walk out there and to say I did something I didn't do. I finally got a little weak, and I decided, I said, well, I'll try to take the program. I sat in there. It has two parts. The first part was just miserable. We got to the second part, they told me, said, I wasn't going to pass anyway because I never said anything. They said I wouldn't participate, but I was sitting in there. But for the second part, they said you had to sign a piece of paper with an admission of guilt. I said, an admission of guilt? I said, well, that's it for me. And I walked out. I never completed the program, never took that. And so every time that I came up for parole, the parole board called themselves trying to break me by giving me longer and longer set-offs each time. Years went by and I felt like a walking time bomb. I felt like a rubber band just, any minute, just how you stretch it, it's a pow, like I was just gonna snap. I was that close, I was on the edge of being sane or insane. And I got so where there was nothing I could do. I just gave up, fell weak, fell down on my knees, and I just started praying. Old-fashioned prayer. And it strengthened me. Then I found out about a program called DNA. I heard about DNA technology. I said, what, DNA technology? I found out where people were getting out of prison on this new technology. I said, what? If I could get a DNA test, then I could prove my innocence. But I didn't know how to go about it. I thought it was some fantastic thing that may cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. I had no clue. So they had a little lawyer that used to come into the prison it was a prison legal counseling project. He used to come and help out people with habeas corpus and small things like that. And I went to him one day, and I sat down, and I told him my whole story. When I got through my story, I looked him in the eye and said, you don't have to believe a word I said. And the reason why I told him that, because he hears all kinds of stories. Some of the best con men are in prison. But I said, let me send you my transcript, and you read it. And I sent him my transcript, and he read it. And he came back, and he couldn't believe it. He said, this is the worst case of injustice that I've ever seen in my entire history of being a lawyer. He said, never before have I seen anything like this. And he said, I'm going to try to help you. But he said, first thing we got to do is try to find the evidence. So we went looking for the evidence. After all these years, they had no laws in Georgia at that particular time to preserve evidence. After the case, if they wanted to, they could just do what they want with the evidence. They could throw it out. Things have changed since then. But they didn't have any laws set. So we went looking for the evidence. Come to find out, we found it. But the evidence had been taken, and it had been taken off the shelf and thrown into a trash bin with other evidence to be discarded. Somebody from the attorney's office, district attorney's office, was walking outside and saw all this evidence in the trash bin and said, why is this evidence there in the trash bin? And for whatever reason, my evidence was put back on the shelf. I look at it as a miracle. And that evidence was later tested. We had to file a motion called an extraordinary motion for a new trial based on newly discovered evidence, which means basically that they had evidence now that existed that didn't exist when I first was incarcerated. This is evidence that came along years later that could possibly prove my innocence. And if it does through DNA technology and DNA testing, then I should be given a chance, at least a new trial. They took it to the laboratory, they tested it, and the first test came back inconclusive. Inconclusive. I got a call from my attorneys in New York, which happened to be Barry Scheck and Peter Newfield of the Innocence Project at that time. And the way I came across those guys, I want to just go back and tell you about that. The way I came across those guys was a friend of mine in Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio, not far from here. Actually, it was a guy coming through the soup kitchen, and my aunt looked at him and said, "Hey, why are you should be out working, young man. Why are you coming through the soup kitchen?" And he explained to her that he got out of prison. And she said, "Well, if you give us that information and bring it back to us, we'll give you some clothes and help you out a little bit." He did. They kept their part of the bargain, and it was information to the Innocence Project. I wrote the Innocence Project, and they looked at my case and they said, "Wow, this is unique. It's like something we never seen, like two rats in a cage. One jury gets this verdict, another jury gets that verdict, but yet you're still in prison." And they decided to take on my case. So Barry Scheck and Peter Newfeld were my attorneys, and they gave me a call. And they said that you can allow the laboratory to test it again, and if they use it up, then you won't have anything else to go on. All the evidence will be gone. Or you can wait till better technology comes forth, and maybe we can do a better test. Or the last choice would be you can send it to a guy in California named Dr. Edward Blake, who's supposed to be one of the best forensic scientists in the country or in the world. I said, let's send it to Mr. Blake. We sent it to Mr. Blake, and the evidence came back, and it showed by so many odds, I can't give the number, million or so-and-so, that there was no way that I could have committed the crime. That was in November of 1998. I still didn't walk out of prison until June 15, 1999. But on that day, through the Innocence Project and the help, I walked out of prison a completely free man, and my new life began. And that new life was special. I'm married now. I've actually been through the same thing that some of you have gone through, divorced and remarried. But I've been divorced, I've been remarried. I have a wonderful daughter, 13 years old. She'll be 13 in October. I might well say she's 13. I'm truly blessed, nice home, good job, and I have an opportunity to share my story and to educate people, because America, as I said, is a great country, but it's not perfect. And we have to do our part, and we can't just assume things are as they look. We have to look at the facts, and we have to look deeply, and we have to be fair about it. There's been over 300 people across the United States that have been exonerated through DNA technology. Some of them are set on death row. Some of them we may never know about, may have already been executed. It's a sad situation when you look at it. But if you get the wrong person, what happens then? That means that there's somebody out there that's still committing that same crime. And usually years later, if you do, through a DNA database, find out who he is, he's either in jail or guilty of several other series of crimes. We have to do our part to change and to improve the imperfect system. My name is Calvin C. Johnson, Jr. I want to thank you all for your time and for listening to my story.
It's hard to follow, right? I mean, my name's Stephen Saloom. I'm the policy director at the Innocence Project, and I just stand in awe of people like Calvin who've been through what you have. There are 310 others in this country who DNA has exonerated from wrongful conviction. There are a large number of others, but not large enough, of others without DNA who've been exonerated. And there are, without a doubt, tens of thousands, at least, more people who've been wrongfully convicted of crimes they didn't commit and could not prove their innocence through the courts. There's so much to say about this. My name's Stephen Saloom. I'm the policy director at the Innocence Project. What we do at the Innocence Project in the policy department is we look at every single one of those tragedies, the wrongful convictions that DNA has proven was wrongful, Because when the DNA proves it, you know without a doubt. No one can come back and say, well, I don't believe it. Well, I don't care what you believe. That's the science. It proves this person was innocent. We got it wrong. When you have that certainty, you can go back to that specific case as an opportunity to learn and say, what was it that led police, prosecutors, judges, and juries to think that an innocent person was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt on every element of a crime? Because that's what you got to prove to get a conviction of somebody. And when we've looked at these 311 cases, what we've found is that there are consistent contributing factors to wrongful convictions. What we do in the policy department at the Innocence Project, our primary focus is on reforming those elements of the criminal justice system that create wrongful convictions. Because, well, of course, because we want to prevent wrongful convictions, but also, as Calvin noted, when the criminal justice system has decided to convict and incarcerate an innocent person for a serious crime, you have not convicted the real perpetrator for that crime. And in some 40% of cases, we've documented that those people have gone on to commit and be convicted of other serious crimes, and that's a low estimate. So it's really important that we learn this lesson when we go back. In Calvin's case, there were a number of problems. There were forensic problems, and certainly there was an eyewitness identification problem. The problems in the criminal justice system are legion, and we know about this throughout the country, but through the DNA testing and looking at these cases, we see some specific problems that we're able to drill down on and address, and it's really, frankly, a privilege and an honor to be able to do that work. In 75%, in 3 out of every 4 of the nation's DNA, wrongful convictions proven by post-conviction DNA testing, the wrongful conviction was the result, at least in part, from at least one eyewitness misidentification. In some of these cases, an innocent person was misidentified by 5 different people. And I understand that earlier today, I wasn't able to be here for it. You heard about really the fallibility of our brains. And we've learned a lot about, through research about the fallibility and the malleability of human memory. And so the top reform, our top priority at the Innocence Project is reforming the process of conducting eyewitness identification procedures. What research shows is that what is traditionally done when I'm the arresting officer and I have arrested Mr. Johnson, I bring him in and I say, all right, get in a lineup, and I'll get some people that look somewhat like Calvin, and I call the witness down and say, look, we need you to come down. We think we've got the guy. We want you to look at a lineup and see if you can pick him out. When that happens, there are a number of problems, and it needs to be done differently. I'm just going to break this down for you just for a minute, because this is an important topic for Kentucky, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. The problem is, with any experiment, you never want the examiner, the person that's supposed to be coming up with the answer, or that's administering the experiment, to know what the answer is supposed to be, because they can give inadvertent cues to the person who's taking the test. So anytime you do an eyewitness identification procedure, you do not want the officer who arrested the suspect or who knows who the suspect is to be administering the eyewitness identification procedure, because he or she might inadvertently or sometimes even intentionally steer the person towards an individual. We've got shades of that from Calvin's story. And say, well, maybe the person comes up and says, well, I have so little time. So that can happen. Another thing is you want to compose a lineup based not on people that look like the suspect, but based on the description given by the witness. If the lineup in Calvin's case was composed of people who were clean-shaven, he would stand out as obviously not the person who committed the crime. But instead, if you don't base it on that, and it's more around what the suspect looks like, the person is more confused. You need to give instructions to the witness when they come in, before they participate in the procedure, that, see, they come in, the witness comes in and says, I want to solve this crime. I think the police have it. I don't want to screw this up. I hope I can remember who the person is. And there's an inherent anxiety created in the witness. And research shows that if the police say, look, Mr. Johnson, come down and look at the lineup, but I want you to know that it's as important not to, to clear the innocent people as it is to identify the guilty person through this lineup, and that the investigation is going to continue whether or not you make a selection here, the number of incorrect picks and consistent research drops significantly because that pressure comes off the person. You also want to take an immediate confidence statement if any identification is made. So number one, you want the blind examiner, so the person, if the officer administering the lineup doesn't know if you picked the right person or not because they don't know which person is the suspect, that's inherently valuable. It's especially valuable when there is any kind of an identification, because research shows that if I'm the officer and someone goes ahead and picks someone and says, and looks at them and says, oh, well, I think it's number 3. If I say right then, how confident are you? The answer could be anything from, well, I'm not really sure, or it could be, I'm pretty sure that's him, or it could be, that's the person, I'll never forget his face. It makes a difference what is said. And so you want to document that right there, because you can imagine if at trial they say, well, who did you identify? And it was number 3, it was Mr. Johnson, and you don't have that range of feeling with it, it's a very different situation. But the most important reason to take that confidence statement immediately is because of the malleability of human memory, the bolstering that can happen. If I know, for example, well, here's the exact study. It says, there's a study that's called Good, You Pick the Suspect. So if someone is not 100% sure, even 30, 40% sure, and makes a selection, and they asked, how certain are you? They say, well, 40%. And they said, okay, good, because that's who we think it is. Now, how confident are you? Their confidence rate jumps up, so that what you get is the situation, as in Calvin's case, where the witness says, that's the man right there, I'll never forget him by the time you get to trial. So you need to take an immediate confidence statement to understand you have the best sense of the person's memory. And you also need to you need to document the procedure, and you need to show people one at a time and not all at once. If you show them sequentially as opposed to simultaneously, what you will get is really the witness's sense of, is that the person? Is that the person? Is that the person? As opposed to an array of people where what happens, the research shows, is they pick the person who looks most like the person in their memory, whether it's right or not. So that's eyewitness identification. That's a top priority issue of the Innocence Projects. In 50% of the cases of the nation's wrongful convictions, there was invalid or improper forensic evidence that contributed to the wrongful conviction. 2009, the National Academy of Sciences, our most esteemed scientific body in America, wrote a report on forensic science in America that said, essentially, except for DNA testing, there is not one individualization science, forensic practice, I should say. There's not one individualization assay, fingerprints, bite marks, pattern evidence, whatever it might be, that actually has a scientific foundation. They're not scientifically valid, yet we rely on them day in and day out. And on top of that, there have been a number of forensic scandals throughout the country over the years. Increasingly, we're addressing this. We're trying to implement the NAS report recommendations. We're trying to get scandals properly looked into. Very quickly, false confessions are a factor in 25% of cases. It's a phenomenon we never realized existed. But it's more true than we ever realized, and by simply recording interrogations, you can go a long way towards identifying a false confession and therefore not convicting an innocent person. Because you can imagine, if a jury hears that someone confessed to a serious crime and the person's still challenging the accusation in court, they've got a hard way to go, and they're very likely to be convicted. One thing quickly, I'm almost out of time here. One other thing I just want to talk about is the fact that 29 of these 311 wrongfully convicted people had pled guilty, in fact, and that happens far more often than we ever realized. I'm going to take one more minute and note that last year, Kentucky, with leadership from Senator Stickle, Representative Bell, the governor, and even the Jefferson County prosecutors, greatly expanded your post-conviction DNA access law. It was an excellent move, and they all deserve great credit. Two things I want to say about that. The one thing that they didn't do was allow people who had pled guilty to even be able to ask a judge for permission to get post-conviction DNA testing. That's being considered in the Kentucky Supreme Court right now, and we're hopeful that that will be changed. Otherwise, we will go back and talk with those same people to allow testing for these people too. And the other thing is that I I could give a seminar on all this stuff that we need to talk about Calvin's case and everything. But the other thing I want to leave you with is the fact that Kentucky has looked at eyewitness ID reform. It's not presently in place here, but that's going to be coming. The Innocence Project is going to be talking with people in Kentucky about this very issue with those same leaders. Y'all have done great work in starting to pick up on the lessons learned from wrongful convictions, and you need to keep up on it because, number one, any innocent person's life is too dear to be wasted in the absolute nightmare of prison and really the devastation it can cause to their lives. And the public is not safe when we're convicting innocent people and letting the real perpetrators of serious crimes go free. We thank you very much for your attention today, and we look forward to the Q&A and have more with you. You want one?
Is it on? Okay,
There you go.
now we're on. Yeah, thank you so much. Again, we have mics. Please start to line up now if you're interested in asking a question. We've got about 15 minutes left. I'd like to ask, one of the things I desperately wanted to ask is, as a society, we understand mistakes get made, okay? Mistakes, no system is perfect. Certainly in Calvin's case, there were an infinite number of warnings that were not heeded. But for us as a society, what do we do with situations like Calvin? What do we do as a society when we wrongfully convict people and people are in jail for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, sometimes they're executed? For us as a society, how do we handle that?
Well, very, very quickly, I think one thing that everybody can agree on, when the government takes your property, it's called a taking, and you deserve to be compensated. When the government takes years of your life, you deserve to be compensated for that same. We can all agree on this. The standard is generally $50,000 per year of incarceration. That's critically important. Immediate services are needed. The day you walk out, you have a great family and you're very fortunate to have had them to turn to, but it's still extremely hard in a million different ways. You need immediate services that day you're released. You need to be able to get around. You need transportation, housing, meds, probably there's bad, and a number of different things. So immediate services and compensation. And as important to many people as all of that, although in a different way, is you deserve an apology. Even if it's not one person who takes personal responsibility, but an apology from that same state that did this to you. We are sorry that we did this to you. And an acknowledgement of the person's innocence as well. And Calvin, you know better than I do, but these are some of the things that we advocate for.
Yeah, Calvin, I'm amazed that you came out not an incredibly bitter person, so I'm interested in your reaction to that question too, as an individual.
Well, Steve answered it very, very, very well.
Were you compensated in some way? Excuse me.
I had to fight for compensation. In Georgia, the Innocence Project has gotten laws passed in some states where they automatically compensate you. There are a lot of states that still do not have compensation laws. Mm-hmm. And there's some states where it's actually an insult. I know one guy that got like maybe $150,000 after doing over 20 years. That's like a slap in the face. And you can never repay a person for the years lost. You can't repay me for not being able to go to spending Christmas with the family, not to be able to go to maybe a family member's funeral, not to watch my child, if I had a child at the time, grow up. You can't repay that. But you come out, as I said, you're like a baby. If you had any type of skills, educational-wise, they have eroded. You need training. You need opportunity to have a job, to be able to work, because you come out, if you don't have a job, you're dependent on other people, so you still feel like you don't have the self-esteem built up in you. You have to build that back up. And a lot of guys need psychological help because they're looking over their shoulders. You've already been falsely accused one time of being of something that you didn't do. And some guys can't even walk across the street without looking over their shoulders. And it's hard. So if you don't have that family support, as he said, I was very, very fortunate that I did. A lot of guys don't. And you don't have benefits because you don't have a job. You don't have good credit because you had no credit. So not that you have bad credit, but you don't have any credit, so you can't even go out and say, hey, I want to get an apartment.
Right.
It's a huge adjustment, but awareness.
Okay.
So that people, the young people that are here, who are going to be our future politicians, our future lawyers, our future judges, that are going to be in those positions, they can make the right decisions and not be so, some of you that may sit on a jury, may sit on the next jury you sit on, that you look at things differently. I mean, don't just let everybody, walk out of prison, because some of them need to be there, but just look at it closely.
Question, yes, please identify yourself too.
Hi, my name is Elle Fuller, and I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. John Grisham wrote a book called The Innocent Man, and it's very similar to kind of your case. It was about a gentleman named Ron Williamson who was wrongfully convicted. And in the book, I found it very interesting that the prosecutor that helped convict him still believed, even after he was found innocent, that he was guilty. My question is, are there any programs or I guess repercussions for the people that wrongfully convict the innocent? And if not, is there any type of training or anything that they have to go through after they've wrongfully convicted somebody so that it doesn't happen again?
Good question.
Prosecutorial oversight is an issue that we're working on. The answer is no. The answer is no, and typically nowhere is that true. And
Texas.
Well, although in Texas, and go ahead if you want to. I mean, Michael Morton's when the prosecutor, him or herself, actually manufactured the wrongful conviction, they can be subject to criminal charges. And you all should pay attention to the Michael Morton case. Go Google it, look on our website, whatever it is. In a rare instance like that, you can get that. But typically, the answer is no. True. And so it's really a matter of getting our short answer is we allegedly have all these systems in place to educate, train, oversee prosecutors and make sure that when there is a real problem that's being addressed. What we've found in research around the country is that those systems essentially don't work, and we're going to be coming out with a report in about 6 months that you'll see that addresses some of this.
Yes, sir.
My name's Josh Williams. I'm from Murray State University. In the beginning, you started with this deep, moving statement and story about rage while you were in prison. How did you learn to control that rage once you were out? Because if it were me, I would still be angry and bitter and upset and mad, especially at the people that had wrongly convicted me, and the jury, for that matter. How did you deal with that on a personal level to keep yourself from going?
Well, I agree with you, and to a certain extent. But as I said, rage and bitterness is something that can consume you, and that also can control you. And as long as you allow rage and bitterness to consume you, then you allow somebody to have control over your life. And that means that the people that put you there are still being victorious over you. If you can defeat that rage and that bitterness and let go, forgive, and move on, then you can be victorious and determine your own fate and your destiny in your life without that control always holding you back. And that's what'll happen. It'll hold you back. Now, how I dealt with it and how other people deal with it may be different. I dealt with it through the power of prayer. I turned to God because I couldn't do it alone. And only through the power of God in my life was I able to let go and let God. That's the only way. Now, I'm not trying to put any type of religious faith on anybody, but that's personally the way I dealt with it.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Trevor, and I'm a sophomore at the University of Kentucky. And I was wondering how the Innocence Project kind of decides what cases to take on, because I'm sure you get a lot of interest from people all over the country, and what moves are being made by the Innocence Project to expand, to kind of look into more cases.
The Innocence Project only handles cases where DNA, post-conviction DNA testing could prove innocence. We have to be written to by the person who is claiming innocence, and there's a long process, unfortunately, where we have to get the documents and review them and make sure that, and then if the case is accepted and we see that, yes, that DNA that seems to exist in this case, if we found it and tested it and it excluded the petitioner, we'll say, the court would be persuaded that they should, that they should vacate the conviction. If that's the case, then we will take the case and try to find the evidence, and as Calvin was saying, often it's not there. Very often it's not there. But we don't try to figure out ahead of time. We've learned very well, you can't figure out. Look, let me back up for a second. The criminal justice system is a system. Doesn't get it right every time. It can't get it right every time, and we are painfully aware of that. So, we ask. So, if we think the testing, if we could do it, and exclude the person, would require the vacating of the conviction, we will pursue the testing. Sometimes that means that we do testing for people who are guilty, and that's how it happens. We work with. There are 55 different projects around the country. There's a Kentucky Innocence Project, by the way, and if you go to innocencenetwork.org. You will see a list of all the innocence projects around the country. Some also take cases where it's not DNA evidence, but non-DNA evidence that could prove the wrongful conviction as well. So we work with them. We work in collaboration with them. Projects have grown. The network's grown a lot with different projects over the years. We've grown, and so we do all the best that we can.
Yes, sir.
Alfred Mall. Would the Innocence Project see benefit in a bigger, larger policy way of directing some attention to the 13th Amendment that still allows slavery, which Mr. Johnson basically was put into once he was convicted?
The hardest thing for us, and even the hardest thing for me to talk today, was to pick which of the issues to focus on, because the hardest thing is, even we haven't, our top priority is eyewitness ID reform. I've been working on it for the 9 years I've been there. We aren't there yet. And so if what we've had to sometimes struggle to do is stay focused on our top priorities and the seemingly best ways to have the greatest impact. And so therefore we're not there yet. But it's this breaks out in a million different ways. I was talking with KET, I think it was, earlier today about just simply the racial disparity in the entire criminal justice system, but you could get to the indigent defense problems around the whole country. It's like shooting fish in a barrel trying to figure out the contributing factors. So no, for that reason we haven't.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Taylor Ratliff, and I go to DuPont Manual here in Louisville. My question is directed toward Mr. Johnson, and I've heard stories of people who have also gone through terrible situations like you have, and they claim that they still wouldn't take away that experience because it's allowed them to write books and to speak in front of crowds and to draw attention to societal problems that we have. So if given the opportunity to remove this injustice from your life, would you do it?
Heck yeah. I mean, do you think I would volunteer to go to jail for 16 years? I mean, now, true enough, I have learned. I've learned a lot from it, and I've been able to touch a lot of lives through my situation and through speaking and through my story. And I've been able to educate people, help them to learn about some of the atrocities that are happening across the country as far as criminal justice and people being falsely incarcerated. So in many ways, it strengthened me. It gave me stronger character. I've been through the trials and tribulation and withstood and come out on top. And I've learned from it. But no, I wouldn't do it again.
Yeah. And I want to pick up on that for 1 second. I mean, y'all might believe whatever you believe, but as far as I can tell, we get one shot here on earth. And to have the guts of your life, your formative adult years stripped from you, much less even what you have to endure in prison, I almost can't think of a worse thing that can happen to anybody. I mean, I'm sure there are a couple, but there aren't many. 25
to 41. I went in at 25, I got out at 41. My 42nd birthday was about a month later. That's a lot of time missed. I missed the 80s and the 90s. It's pretty good years.
Yeah.
Especially the music in the 80s, right? Yes, sir.
My name is Lincoln Hearn. I'm a junior at DuPont Manual High School here in Louisville. And Mr. Johnson, earlier on you mentioned that a lot of times people who are accused of a crime will be assumed by the public to be guilty before they've even been tried. Do you think there are any ways that we can change our perceptions of accused people here in this country so that people truly are considered innocent until they're proven guilty instead of the other way around?
One of the greatest ways to help that is through publicity. and through the work of the Innocence Project by showing, I mean, before this was unheard of. We never, every once in a while you might hear about somebody being found through the appeals court or something saying that they didn't commit a crime. But now you have 310 people, some on death row, and some even that admitted that they were guilty, but weren't. It was just through the interrogation process that they just broke down and just yelled out, yeah, I'm guilty of something, when they weren't, just to get it over with. Awareness, public awareness, getting the word out through publicity, television media, radio media, the work of the Innocence Project, and just letting people know that, hey, this isn't something that just happens. It's something that's still happening, and people are still getting out. I've heard some of the lawyers at the Innocence Project say this is just the tip of the iceberg. And people say, well, when will it end? It's never going to end. It's never going to end. We got to keep bringing awareness to everybody and do our best to make everybody aware through the media process and through our work.
And one thing's breaking right now. I see we got a minute left. Y'all should Google FBI hair review or go to the website, the Innocence Project website, and look at this. The FBI is reviewing thousands of cases because they were using bad hair evidence to convict people around the country. It's involved in a death row case, Manning in Mississippi, but this has impacted thousands of cases, and these same FBI folks trained people in the state labs all around the country on hair evidence, and no review has yet been done because we're trying to figure out how to do it. This is, talk about the tip of the iceberg, this is something that I think is going to help that very good question that you just asked, people understand that this happens.
Yes, sir.
My name is Michael Crawford, and I attend DuPont Manual High School. My question is for Mr. Calvin. Does your family still receive ridicule because of this whole event? And did they ever catch who committed the crime?
Okay, I'm gonna speak fast because time is running short. No, they don't still receive ridicule. If anything, they receive respect and admiration that they had a son that withstood this and remained strong and came out with a positive attitude and went forward with his life, which I have done. In the beginning, when I was arrested, sure, it affected my mother who was in social clubs and so forth. And people look at you differently, and people whisper and say things behind your back. So it affects everybody. It affected me, it affected my family, and yes, they had to go through ridicule. But now, since I've been out for years and I've stayed positive and I've gone on to be a successful professional businessman, no, now they look at us as admiration for a family that stood by their son and was there for me, and a son who came out and did what was right and forgave and moved on with his life.
Did they ever find the perpetrator of the crime?
No, they never found a perpetrator of the crime in my situation. I don't even think they even looked.
That's right.
Because of the fact that they claimed that they couldn't find the victim. They said without the victim there would be no case and no trial. But I mean, this day of high technology, how can you not find somebody?
Right. One more quick question. Yes, ma'am.
My name's Delaney. I'm from Western High School. I was wondering if you guys feel that it is fair for lawyers and the parole board to push you to say you were guilty even though you weren't. Do you think it's fair that they're able to do that?
No, it's not fair. That's the job. I mean, once you get convicted by a jury of your peers, everybody in the system, as far as the correctional system, incarceration, everybody there, takes that as law. You know, that's the only way they look at it. The counselor looks at it and says, well, they said you're guilty, so this is what I have to go by. The people that work there say, well, they said you're guilty, this is what I have to go by. The parole board, people that are working on the parole board, they said, well, you were found guilty by a jury of your peers, this is what we have to go by. And so, even though it may not be fair, that's the only thing they have to go by, and that's what they are going to go by.
But what I will add is that in the U.S. Supreme Court that established that there's not a constitutional right to post-conviction DNA testing, they partially noted that Mr. Osborne, that Osborne is the case, that Mr. Osborne had availed himself of the parole. He was willing to admit guilt in order to get paroled, and that they used that against him when he tried to get post-conviction DNA testing to prove he was still innocent. So I think I agree with Calvin's answer. there still needs to be work done on some of that, but it certainly shouldn't deny someone post-conviction DNA testing access if they do avail themselves of that program. Because imagine that, I mean, you heard the choice he had to make.